Thank you everybody for having me. Good evening. I hope you had a great day and you are going to relax and learn more about how taxonomies can solve business problems. As Nikki was saying, I have the privilege of working for a company that brings together clients from different sectors. And in my role as head of customer success, I'm working with our clients to help them achieve their business goals and doing that by using our technology. A few fun facts about me, since it's the evening and everybody is kind of like thinking of the end of the day as a way to learn more about how taxonomies. I started my career as a researcher and worked for Sorbonne Paris-Nord, actually at the very beginning to build what we call semantic controlled vocabularies or dictionaries for pharma insurance companies. After my PhD, I became more and more interested how natural language applications in particular are used by organizations. And I joined the technology space 14 years ago. What I'm really fascinated about is how language can be used in conjunction with technology to drive insights from data, and also help us better understand what matters in the amount of unstructured information that we're working with. So for our presentation today, I would like to introduce the session topics. Hope everybody can see my screen. I'll focus on one of my favorite topics, like I said, taxonomies. I will refer to taxonomies as a practice for data modeling to power information applications. I will also mention some of the challenges that we have when working with taxonomies when they are used for documents, classification, and management. Finally, I will walk you through some real-life examples of how taxonomies, when mapped with a cognitive technology or semantic technology, can help solve some of the most complex challenges that organizations face when they deal with unstructured documents. And this is unstructured content or unstructured documents can range from anything that is text-based documents to web pages, social media, news articles, and other language-based assets. So let's dig in. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about what is a taxonomy. I want you to think of your own definition of a taxonomy, and hopefully some of the things that I will say will relate to how you envision the taxonomy. But as a general definition, I would say that taxonomies are used to identify and classify information into a certain structure, which is usually hierarchical. And we do that with the objective to analyze content against these taxonomies. They provide terms or categories that are given for a specific domain. And we think in terms of topics that describe this domain and different relationships that the terms have within the domain, whether it's a broader relationship or a narrow relationship, or in sometimes what we call parenthood. So different relationships between the terms that are at the same level. But the most important thing to keep in mind when we talk about the taxonomy, and its very own origin, I would say, is that taxonomies are here to classify. They help us classify. And some of you, and maybe probably most of you, work also with ontologies and knowledge graphs. Ontologies are very good at specifying things, while taxonomies are very good at classifying things. So that's a very easy way to relate to a definition of taxonomies. And I have here a very easy example, which I know has been probably seen by most of you when it comes to the original taxonomical classification. So we have a cat that is a carnivore, a mammal, a chordate, and an animal. And obviously, we have for each domain different ways to visualize taxonomies. We can design taxonomies for domain where we're looking to provide a comprehensive view of that domain, like I said, from broad to specific, or the other way around. And here we have an example from the medical domain with a subset of infections and parasitic diseases. Beyond the hierarchical view of the taxonomies or of the domain that the taxonomies describe, taxonomies are interesting because they rely on these relationships that keep, I would say, connecting to each other with terms that are linked through specific, I would say, dependencies that they have with other taxonomy terms. I have here also another example from the media world with IPTC media topics. This is a taxonomy that is used usually for classifying the views in different categories that are very generic, and then start declining, I would say, into in smaller categories that are more specified. And last but not least, in terms of definitions of a taxonomy, here we have also an example of how a taxonomy is actually applied to text. So we have an example of a document that has been categorized into specific categories using the same taxonomy that we have had a snapshot of, the IPTC media topics. So we're dealing with 5 different categories that are driven by the same taxonomy. And this single document can be tagged with terms that come from these different branches. So at the beginning, we start with an unstructured document, and we end up with categories that are driven by this taxonomy. And we do that because we map the taxonomy where we use it with a semantic engine. In the digital world, taxonomies become, when applied to content, what we call semantic metadata. So we use them to organize content, to drive associations from the topics that they refer to. And when taxonomy is applied to text via technology, what we get actually is, I would say, a sort of a vector of features that is driven by the taxonomy. And this taxonomy becomes actually a way to visualize semantic relationships between topics that tell us a story. Now, we talked about the definition of taxonomies, and the title of my presentation is How Taxonomies Help Us Solve Complex Business Problems. These business problems are obviously connect to unstructured content. So what I'm going to do right now is that I'm going to take you to some of the, I would say, most common challenges that we see from a business perspective when dealing with content. So first of all, I would say the biggest example that we have in terms of challenge for content that is unstructured is around dealing with a content that is hard to navigate. So we have a lack of the data structure with content that is not organized in clearly delimited categories. And this makes the navigation very difficult. If data is not standardized, then, and you also have documents that are in multiple languages, so it can be English, French, Spanish, or what have you, like it's the case for news organizations that have content in multiple languages, then the challenge is even bigger. So what is our response to this? How do we deal with this kind of challenge? Before our presentation last Friday, while working on my presentation, I was looking for some examples of how we can actually prove this type of difficulty in navigating content with, I would say, a site that is accessible by each of us. So when we have data sources that are not consistently indexed, content is hard to navigate because we don't have actually a taxonomy or some other control vocabulary that helps us drive some kind of connections to navigate easier in this type of content. This is an example of a search I performed. And what I typed at the beginning was Internet of Things. And if you look at these results, the results are presented according to the keywords that I typed here. And what I did is, obviously Internet of Things is associated also with an abbreviated form that is IoT. I performed the same search on the same website. And what I did is very different results. So in an example, I had more than 300 articles that popped up for the Internet of Things on the left. And on the right side, I had 3,000 articles. So if the website I'm referring to was using a taxonomy that standardized data, then these results of the search would have been consolidated. So this is an example where, because we don't have content that is easy to navigate with a taxonomy, we end up with results that are very different from our expectations. Another example is in terms of unstructured content and challenges that are associated with this unstructured content is when we have silos with sources that are disconnected. And I gave the example before with news organizations, but it also applies to information services companies that have content content that sits in different sources that are not necessarily connected. And when we have sources that are not connected, it's a very different, let's say, it's very different, a very different experience from when we have sources that are connected, in the sense that if we perform the same type of search as the one that they had before, we will probably get very fragmented and disconnected results. So the obstacle for navigation is because the content is siloed, but it's also because we don't have a way to connect these data sources with a global strategy that is usually provided by a control vocabulary like a taxonomy. Inconsistencies across the data sources, it's also what makes everything challenging when we're thinking about data archives that we have also maybe in different silos that we cannot connect. Now, I will give you here an example of, I would say, ways in which different challenges like the ones I mentioned around the inconsistency of the tagging or the consistency of the tagging can be shown. Many search applications present the most recent content that matches a given query. While it might be expected to look for the latest information available on a subject, it doesn't always correspond to the best match that we have in mind when we perform a search. Older content is still very valuable. And for organizations that have archives, they're frequently faced with the challenge of not being able to explore these archives. So that obviously it's a challenge that we're trying to solve with this idea of using the taxonomy as the backbone of tagging across different sources. And here I have a great example of indexing that was performed by one of our clients, the National Library and Archives of Quebec. It's actually BANQ. They maintain a catalog of media assets that are related to the province of Quebec, which include collections of documents, I think also pictures, videos, and certain audio files that have captions. So they use this to, I would say, go back 50 or 60 years to the very development of the province of Quebec, actually. So when we started our collaboration with this particular client, they wanted to make sure that the most relevant assets that they had were resurfaced by their website, regardless of their age. And they put the emphasis on valuing their collections of media elements by properly indexing them with their historic names and recent names. And so in this example, we have Boulevard René Lévesque, which was named after Boulevard Dorchester in 1964. So again, this is an example where we overcame this challenge of not connecting the data sources. The third one is more around what we call information that cannot be accessed efficiently, or inefficient search, in other words. And I'm sure that, in your experience with content and with just navigating on websites, you came across this difficulty when you're actually having in mind a specific query and you ended up with results that were not relevant. So when we're overwhelmed with, let's say, choices that are not what we initially had in mind when we perform searches, it means that the content or the strategy that is behind that content is not relying on anything that helps us structure knowledge in a meaningful way. Imagine, for instance, what you might be thinking of tonight when you're looking for a way to make dinner. And some of you might be maybe gluten-free intolerant, and you're looking for recipes where you have, gluten-free ingredients that you can use for your recipe. So if you type gluten-free ingredients on the web, you'll find hundreds of recipes that are filtered, and maybe not all of them are going to be relevant because you have that list of ingredients. And you would need something that actually presents you maybe with the top 10 or 15 recipes that have only those ingredients that I'm interested in. So inconsistent search would be when you would have too many results that are not relevant, and obviously when you would have also results that don't make any sense. So in this case, you end up dropping the search and you'll probably just use your imagination and whatever tools you have handy in your kitchen to build that recipe. Now, what we hear from users that struggle with this type of challenge or inconsistent search or inefficient search is that you might have let's say, people that look for relevant information and they spend a lot of time researching for multiple portals, and they face this inconsistent indexing because they have hard time accessing historical data, or they have hard times navigating to the website because content is organized in too many places. You can't find any historical data. You don't know where to look for the information, and maybe the website is unorganized. And some people spend time just, like coding or making up rules that will help them have more relevant queries. And in the end, because of the inefficient search, they end up by not using the system. So why do we need to overcome these challenges about language and unstructured content? And what would be the benefits? So I gave an example of 3 most common challenges for data discovery. I'm sure there are many more I would say, derivations of these initial challenges. But the objective in the end is to, I would say, tackle 3 main benefits. First of all, it's about, for organizations that have unstructured content and they have users that access this content, it's about driving more engagement from the audience. So you want to make sure that, for instance, you are driving an experience that is not frustrating for the end user, like the one that we experienced before with the inconsistent search, and also make their search efficient means that they will process content more efficiently, and they will be faster in making decisions, and this can be a huge differentiator in the digital market. Second, it's about increasing efficiencies, and this efficiency are around, again, ways in which people they can put the search to their own benefit, but they could also use their teams of subject matter experts to perform search queries that will drive results that they can use, again, to make decisions around new product offerings, or again, finding against searching, right? So it's more about finding what is important versus just searching or surfing. And last but not least, every organization that uses digital content is looking for a way to differentiate from the competition. You can keep up the competitive edge if you leverage your knowledge of a domain through a taxonomy by providing your users with information that is up to date. And this is, again, essential in the way that you also measure the value that is provided by taxonomies when it deals with content that has been structured with these taxonomies. So why do taxonomies matter? Because first of all, they can help us overcome the challenges that we exposed so far. Obviously, taxonomies are not the only ones who can help us do that. There are other ways we can get there. Other knowledge organization experts use ontologies or knowledge graphs, and they also put them to the same, I would say, goal of solving these challenges related to content. And the taxonomy, I think it's quite amazing because you can see it both as a system of classification for topics in any organization, but it's also a living organism that keeps evolving according to the content. Several years ago, I did a presentation at a public event around how you can find the right diet for your ontology with the kind of content that you're using to build that ontology. And the idea was the same. You never really finish the work on a taxonomy or an ontology. They are a living organism because your content is also evolving. So you keep updating your taxonomies and make sure that the content that you're structuring with these taxonomies is kind of like driving the way in which your taxonomies evolve. And the most important thing to keep in mind is that I believe, from what I have seen working with our clients, is that each organization has their own way to represent knowledge and their own way to visualize the description of that domain. So I would say that taxonomy is organization centric because it structures the knowledge that it's representative for that business. or for that organization. So I have here a few animations just to kind of like quiz you to remember, I would say an easy way to think of definitions of a classification provided by a taxonomy, but most importantly, why they matter. They matter because they help us solve these challenges. Now, let me give you some examples, I would say real life examples of how taxonomy solve this problem. So what you will see in a moment from this big CAT scan example is something maybe that catches your eye immediately, is that we have some ambiguity in this sentence. So this is about the big CAT scan, magnetic resonance imaging of the tiger. So taxonomies actually help us to solve ambiguity. Dealing with ambiguity is something that is very easy for us as humans, but it's not easy when it comes to machines, right? So a machine has to actually perform that analysis of the sentence and drive meaning, find meaning and contextual meaning from that sentence. One of the central notions of any classification system is that we use taxonomies to minimize ambiguity. To put it another way, I would say that it's about minimizing the number of buckets that a given document can be put into, preferably up to a point where there are no overlaps between these categories or buckets. So here we have the example of a big CAT scan. The title, like I said, is voluntarily ambiguous because it combines two noun phrases all together in the same sentence, big cat and CAT scan. What we are doing, for instance, at Expert is that we're using our platform to understand the context of this concept and link it to the appropriate definition or category in our knowledge graph. In this example, we properly connect big cat and tiger to their appropriate definitions. And this is a great way for us to bring consistency to the tagging process. In many cases, I would say that if you think of this particular example, you can also think of other ways you can use, CAT scan and MRI as ways to maybe associate, additional terminology that refers to, ways of diagnosing a specific disease for an animal here. But if you have this way to resolve ambiguity with a taxonomy, it provides a great way to provide consistent tagging, consistent search. So the examples that I have here with the cat, the big cat, and the MRI are examples that are, again, I would say triaged or pulled from our knowledge graph that helps us disambiguate the way in which these terms are extracted. Another example, and I have also some other definitions of how we identify the right meaning of that particular scan within our knowledge graph. Now, a different way to illustrate how taxonomy solve the problem is when we have this idea of grouping multiple concepts under the same category. So my favorite example here is with this sentence that will come up in a second around the notion of salt. So dealing with salt as a chemical compound, salt has a variety of synonyms that you can see here from a chemical perspective. And subject matter experts refer to this, I would say, synonyms as labels, alternative labels. If you're interested in any type of salt, if you have chlorate or borate, without naming all of them simultaneously, you might want to leverage a search engine that expands the query to all the types of salts that you have. This is possible, obviously, if you have a way to build this into a taxonomy that will factorize a variety of concepts under the same chemical compound category. And if you do that, you'll have consistency across the way you tag your content, because you'll know exactly to which type of salt you're referring. A third way you can actually use taxonomies to actually have proof that they solve a problem is when they drive insights from patterns that we have in the data that we're looking at. Taxonomies, they can transform this, I would say, unstructured content, especially when we have a large set of documents that we're dealing with, in actionable intelligence. What does it mean? Well, you'll remember that during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, there was little information around the risk factors for COVID-19. So what we did for us to have more insights about this unknown virus is that we leveraged one of the standard taxonomies that we have, the MASH taxonomy, the medical taxonomy that identifies different conditions. And we use this against patient case reports that increase the health risks of patients suffering from COVID-19. So what we did is that we looked at the data and we realized that thanks to the taxonomy, we drove some interesting insights because we realized that we had situations where influenza and COPD were tracked as respiratory tract diseases, but we could also link them to the risk factors of COVID-19. So this type of, I would say, data helped us drive more insights about COVID-19 to identify the most vulnerable patients that had these risk factors. Because we provided this comprehensive view of a domain with the taxonomy, we could give end users more tools to discover connections that they wouldn't find if they surface the content just from a shallow surface perspective, just by writing up keywords. So in this particular case, what happened is that thanks to something that is a taxonomy, we transformed data into something that was actionable, most likely providing insights for patients that were at high risk with COVID. Now, I talked about the definition of the taxonomy. I walked through some examples of challenges that we have with taxonomies. Now, what are the benefits of solving these challenges? First of all, I would say that if you think from the end user perspective, yourself as a person who looks up in different types of content, whether it's navigating news that you have on your phone, or in some cases, going in your own system at your organization, maybe looking in SharePoint, just surfacing different documents. What you want to have in the first, I would say, as the first expectation would be to have a smart navigation. So if you have a way to navigate smoothly, to look at standardized data and have extended queries and even have some auto completion that will help you make your experience more pleasant, then you achieve this goal of having the smart navigation. And you can do this, obviously, if you have a system that is driven by a taxonomy that is mapped with some kind of an NLP engine, and drive this kind of insights to make the navigation more pleasant, but also more standardized in terms of search. So this also allows you, for instance, to look at other benefits that you can have around sources that maybe sit in the same system but are not connected. We talked about the challenge of silos that we have sometimes also in multiple languages. So if we have a system that relies on a taxonomy that allows you to link different content silos, you have a consistent search, and that also affects the end user experience. And also for some organizations that we're working with, this cross-linking of sources gives them also the opportunity to repurpose some of the archives that they have never used or they have used very little. And last but not least, I would say that the ultimate benefit of using taxonomies as a way to solve business problems is around enhancing discoverability, what we call content discoverability. That means that you're going to have obviously a navigation that is easy, but you also have some relevant results and the personalized experience, thanks to some recommendations that the system can make. And of course, some of these benefits are also tied in the way you retrieve data about users and their preferences. A very good example would be Netflix, like when you're watching a movie that has a certain theme that is around certain topics, the system will have recommendations for your next movies that you'll watch that will be very tied to your preferences in the first place. So the system will learn about providing the best recommendations based on some experience around the user, but also based on the topics that you looked up in the first place when you chose your movie or your TV show, which were obviously standardized against taxonomy. Let me walk you through some examples of smart navigation. I'm going to give you here an example of an analysis that we did around COVID. So you see here an example of how we standardize the metadata that comes from different sources. So here we have multiple facets of information that are identified in more than 300,000 documents. You can navigate within different families of conditions that you have here or interventions that are linked to COVID-19. You can also have access to the main sponsors in the publications that have been indexed, as well as their locations and their network of collaborations. We standardize this metadata thanks to different nomenclatures. By nomenclatures, I mean taxonomies. It means that what we did is that our document processing engine connected the information extracted with preferred labels and identifiers in standard taxonomies. So it's not just the taxonomy that drove this kind of results, but multitude of taxonomies. Here we have an example of an extended query where what we did in addition to searching for COVID, we included various synonyms that have been gradually added as alternative labels to our taxonomy. So you can obviously deactivate this option to keep your search more narrow, but it is also extremely powerful to see the extent in this kind of queries can actually lead to, if you have a nice way to centralize or to, I would say, range against around the same preferred label, all these variations or synonyms of COVID. And I bet there are a few of them that you didn't think of. Now, another example that illustrates the way we can, let's say, benefit from having cross-linked sources driven by a taxonomy strategy is if you use the same idea of the taxonomy as the backbone of solving this problem around silos with data. So we did obviously the first research around COVID as well, just to show you, how you can look at the data from a perspective of connecting these different silos. So what we see here are different publication and search projects that are covering multiple sources. So what we did is that we brought together clinical trials registries, Medline databases, and research projects. We have some from the UK here as well as US patents. And what we did is that we performed a search by providing the same search criteria that we applied against this data sources. But the idea was to see, how do you provide consistent tagging across data sources that are apparently not connected? So we did this again in a way to just see from a data perspective how we can surface insights that come from unexplored archives. And in the example I'm giving here, what you see is that a lot of the clinical trials that were around COVID started in 2020. And that makes a lot of sense because that's shortly after the start of the pandemic. I think it was February 2020. However, we also identified many other clinical trials that took place before 2019 on what was known as the family of the coronaviruses. And the COVID-19 obviously belonged to this family. So while COVID was not a keyword in any of the publications that we had at the time, or the trials that we had actually in their system, we were able to link them because of the extended search capabilities and because of the connections that coronaviruses or any topics that were like a coronavirus had with other terms within this nomenclatures or set of taxonomies. So a lot of information to package in a few slides, but if you think about the ways in which taxonomies drive value, it's basically about tackling these problems that are around unstructured content that we want to standardize with a certain vocabulary that is specific to that domain. But I would say that it goes beyond that. My favorite way to think of taxonomies, I would say, and the key takeaways for the taxonomy work and how they solve business problems is that you can have different objectives when you start working with taxonomies. Most of the organizations use taxonomies as a way to group, categorize, and organize content in specific buckets. And if you think of the example that I gave at the beginning of the presentation, the IPTC media topics is a good example where you actually classify content into buckets that are quite generic. And then you use that classification to focus the search maybe on specific categories. News can be about economics, politics, and sports, or what have you. But you have this very high-level view of, I'm using the taxonomy as a way to delimit categories or themes across news. Other organizations are more into addressing objectives that are around making search more accessible, making content more researchable, retrievable. So we always have find against search. I'm looking to find and not so much to search. Find things that matter, that help me, retrieve information that is useful for me. In some cases, we have an objective that is around finding correlations between content. Like, we saw with the example with COVID-19 and COPD, or any respiratory disease. So the taxonomy can help you drive this kind of connections because of the way it was built, because of the connections that we had between maybe terms that were siblings, so they were related terms. And because we use the connections within the taxonomy, we were able to make these connections between diseases, like in the COVID example, that apparently didn't seem connected with influenza or COPD. And last but not least, it's about, I would say, improving that end user experience, right? So we are all, in one way or another, performing search in our everyday life, whether it's about finding gluten-free recipes or just, like finding a restaurant that matches our needs in our neighborhood. So if the end user experience is fruitful and I would say pleasant, is because we have underneath a system that helps us really have that smooth navigation and get what we want in real time and without too much effort. So my question to you, even if this is not that kind of session, would be, when you go back, to having your dinner tonight, think about, how would you use taxonomies? Like, what would be the problem that you would like to solve with the taxonomy? So that's my my question to you. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me and I'm happy to answer them live. If we don't have time to answer those questions, I'm happy to follow up. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and look forward to your feedback.